Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to tonight's talk presented by the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies. Tonight, I'm honoured to present Professor Nicola Phillips recently from the University of Sheffield, now formerly the University of Manchester. Nicola has had a distinguished career as a Latin Americanist. More recently, she's still studying Latin America, but she's broadened, I suppose, in a way, this particular study, and is looking at issues of labour migration, and in particular questions of, I don't know exactly now what the right word is, but forced or coerced or unfree or semi-slave labour around the world, and a major problem. The topic of tonight's talk is the dark side of the migration development nexus in Latin America. Not a very cheerful topic, perhaps in many ways, but a very important one. I remember many years ago when I was an undergraduate doing some study on living conditions in the English Industrial Revolution, in fact in the north of England where Nicola is. And there was a huge debate for many years about whether the transformation of England in that 200 year ago event or period actually meant that people had better lives, that whether the transformation that it made in their lives improves their standard of living, or if you like, the Human Development Index, or it didn't. And even at that point, 200 years afterwards, this was an issue which is unresolved, and I think it's still unresolved today. But every new phase of development, if you want to call it that, or industrial or economic transformation, raises these issues once again. And tonight we're very happy to be able to present a story about Latin America and an analysis of how these changes, these dramatic changes that are taking place in Latin America, are affecting ordinary people in their lives. Nicola will speak for about 40 minutes or 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions and discussion and refreshments, of course, outside in the foyer. So please join me in welcoming Nicola Phillips.
Thank you. Thanks for that very kind introduction, John. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm about to expire, I think, with the temperature in this room. So if everybody's falling asleep halfway through, I'll blame the temperature and not my talk, if you don't mind. If I'm ever invited back to ANU, I think I'm going to come back with cheerful topics, because it's been remarked on several occasions that everything that I've spoken about has been depressing. But nevertheless, I hope, as I said yesterday or a couple of days ago in a seminar on related issues, I hope it's, even if it is depressing, it's nevertheless interesting. And as John said, I think these are issues that have a resonance across the world, not simply in Latin America, but particular contemporary resonance if we're thinking about Latin American development. So the migration development nexus, so-called, has become a topic of great interest and great excitement over recent years, particularly around the mid-2000s. This really became the mantra of the way that people were thinking about global migration as well as migration in the region. It implies, of course, that there is a positive relationship between migration and development. Normally it's interested in the ways in which migration can be harnessed to the cause of development, and of course the key focus in these debates has been on remittances, the money that migrant workers send back to their families in various parts of the world, and particularly in Latin America, countries like the Philippines and others in Southeast Asia, poorer countries in Africa. The idea was that remittances not only constitute a huge flow of financial resources, but also constitute a really important source of development financing, broadly conceived. And it's not difficult to see why this should have arisen. I hope you can all see these figures. It was my attempt to think about the time at the height of the excitement about remittances and their developmental potential, to try to calculate or to try to give a sense of how remittances figured in according to other kinds of economic indicators in Latin America. So calculated not only obviously in absolute volume, but as a percentage of gross domestic product, as a percentage of exports, and so on. And so you can see immediately from these figures that remittances were really important. Look, for instance, at Haiti. by comparison, for instance, with total volumes of remittances to Mexico, Haiti doesn't look particularly significant, but go along the line as a percentage of total net foreign direct investment to one of the poorest economies in the region. We're looking at the region of 11,500%. Similarly, aid, about 500% as a proportion of aid, again, to one of the poorest countries on the planet. Look at Mexico. Again, 2.6% of GDP, which isn't necessarily all that significant because Mexico has a much, much bigger economy than, say, Haiti or Honduras or some of the others where the figures are much larger. But even in Mexico, and remember that this was only 10 or 15 years after the signing of NAFTA and the huge explosion of foreign direct investment into Mexico, we're still looking at remittances of an order of about 160% expressed as a proportion of total foreign direct investment to Mexico. So it's not hard to see where all the excitement came from. And as is always the case with initial excitement, it began to wane as people started to criticise this mantra of migration and development. Some people criticised it on the grounds that what it was really working to do was position migrant workers as the agents of development. The idea was what became called as diasporic development, that it was the responsibility of the diaspora to finance both national development and the livelihoods of their families. And essentially it was seen as a pretext for the state to remove itself even further from the provision from responsibility for the provision of welfare, social safety nets, and so on. So even though remittances were perceived to be a more stable form of financing than foreign direct investment, aid flows, and so on, nevertheless there was concern about both the ethical implications of this migration development nexus as a policy strategy and also the practical considerations associated with what would happen if remittances suddenly dried up. When the financial crisis hit in some of the key destination economies at the end of the 2000s, United States, Spain in particular, the collapse of the construction industry was really crucial. We did see quite dramatic drops in remittances to Latin America. They rebounded. The catastrophe that was predicted at that time in remittances didn't actually materialise, but nevertheless it was some kind of lesson about the dangers of placing too much fervent faith in the power of remittances to spur development. The criticism, though, that I want to focus on today is an argument that I've made before, and it resonates with arguments that some other people have made, that it is erroneous, or at least hazardous, to suggest that there is a positive relationship between migration and development, or at least that this relationship is not as positive as is commonly assumed, particularly in official discourse where the idea is to celebrate the developmental potential of remittances. I want to suggest that outcomes can be characterised instead by high levels of insecurity, exploitation, hardship, both for individual migrant workers and more broadly for large parts of the world's labour force. And this is an element of the question of the relationship between migration and development that hasn't really received all that much attention. So I want to argue that migration and development are integrally related with one another. It's a structural relationship and a very important one, and it can exist as a positive interaction between migration and broader development processes, but that there are significant reasons why that relationship is often not associated with developmentally positive outcomes and instead with what we might call developmentally regressive outcomes. I want to stress right from the beginning, though, that this is not an argument that migration is bad for development. That is not at all what I'm saying. In fact, I hold the contrary view, that there is a very significant developmental potential that arises from patterns of global migration. This argument's been put forward quite a lot, actually, recently, even by the World Bank. But, of course, there are all sorts of political and ideological reasons for which people seek to claim, as I said, that this can be a positive positive relationship. So I'm not saying for a second that migration per se is bad for development. What I'm saying is that there exist a range of barriers to the achievement of that positive relationship between migration and development, and I focus on 4 in this presentation. The first relates to the construction of particular kinds of economic models, particular kinds of labour markets that are associated with an overall flexibilisation of labour. The second is that we've seen across Latin America and the Caribbean, and indeed the global economy, a big expansion of recruitment industries, of smuggling and trafficking networks, and that's a key driver of the kinds of outcomes that I'm talking about. Dynamics of poverty and inequality, and then questions about policy, governance, how immigration policies, labour regulation, anti-trafficking strategies, or the lack of all of these contribute to the problem. And what I want to suggest is that rather than thinking about a migration development nexus, that in some contexts and under some circumstances, we should instead be thinking about what I've rather clumsily called a migration maldevelopment nexus, and that this is an accurate observation of many of the kinds of outcomes that result from the particular type of migration that we're seeing in Latin America and the Caribbean. I just want to take a step back for a moment, though, and indicate my point of conceptual departure, if that's the right way to put it. And it's very simple, really, that when people are talking about the migration development nexus, it matters what we mean by development. That when we're thinking about development in terms of aggregate national economic growth, we might be able to tell one story. If we're thinking about it in terms of human development, the conditions in which people live and work, the social and material conditions in which people live and work, then we might come to very different conclusions. And what I want to suggest is that this is at the heart of the problem. If we're assuming that what develops are countries, are national economies, then the migration development nexus might well be interpreted as being quite positive. If we're thinking that what develops are people and groups of people and the social and material conditions in which they live, then I suggest that we can perceive quite clear evidence of what I've called this migration maldevelopment nexus instead. And I think there's a real problem in the discourse of a tendency not to distinguish between those two types of development, but also, more importantly, to conflate them and imagine that if we see higher levels of aggregate GDP growth, then we must be seeing also a process of human development. And I think the story of global development, as well as development in Latin America over recent years, indicates that that connection doesn't work. In fact, quite the opposite in most cases. So maldevelopment on a sort of aggregate level can drive particular forms of migration. We're accustomed to arguments about the role of poverty, political conflict, inequalities, discrimination, corruption in driving people to leave a particular place and move to another one, although that's a slightly problematic argument, but let's just leave it there for a moment. We can also think in aggregate terms about a migration maldevelopment nexus if we think, for instance, about the consequences of brain drain for national economies and societies. Again, thinking in that first definition of development about that, an idea of national development. But my concern in this presentation is going to be with human development, and I think that that's an important part of the debate. As I said, that is often lacking. There is nevertheless a problem, and I'll come back to this at the end. If we think in national developmental terms, high levels of emigration, say if 80% of your population live and work outside the borders of your country, can be developmentally negative, while for the individual migrant, it can be developmentally very positive in terms of generating better opportunities for employment, better wages, high levels of opportunity, and so on. And so there is a tension in all of these debates about what might be good or bad for the individual migrant and their families and communities, and what might be good or bad for development in aggregate terms. My point is simply that we need to pull those apart before we can then put them back together again and think about the relationship between migration and development. So let me get into that in just a second, but beforehand, try and sketch some of the main patterns of migration in Latin America as a bit of context for this discussion. Obviously, reliable data are a bit scarce, as they are in most regions of the world, particularly given high levels of undocumented migration, informal migration. So we don't have accurate figures. I'm not going to present tables to you. I don't think there's any point in doing that. What I want to sketch are the contours of migration in the region. So, main characteristics. Latin America has gone from being a region which in the middle of the 19th century was essentially a region of immigration to being, in the contemporary period, a region of emigration. And in fact, levels of emigration are accelerating. Immigration in the middle of the 19th century took various forms. The movement of indentured labour, in particular from parts of Asia and Africa, were important. And forms of labour migration from Europe and elsewhere associated with the search for land and economic opportunities. And a good part of immigration flows in the 19th century were actually encouraged by Latin American governments in order to generate the labour supply that was needed for large-scale infrastructural projects. The example of Japanese workers being imported into Brazil is a particularly well-known example. Peru as well, I should indicate, in the context of Japanese workers. And immigration from other Latin American countries or between Latin American countries was also quite important at this time, like the movement of Guatemalan workers to coffee plantations in southern Mexico. In the contemporary period, by contrast, emigration has become vastly more important than immigration for the region as a whole, although, of course, there's variation in particular countries. By recent estimates, immigration accounts for only about 1% of the region's total population. Even though in some countries immigrants continue to exceed emigrants as a percentage of the population. Countries would include Argentina, Costa Rica, Venezuela, and a couple of others. And the number of immigrants, again, as a proportion of the population is highest in some of the Caribbean countries. And the reason for that is very simply that these are very small populations. And so expressed as a proportion, the number of immigrants is relatively more visible than it is in some other countries with larger populations. But emigration is overall by far the most important process. Some indicative estimates, and again we don't have very many because of the high incidence of undocumented migration in this, but some indicative estimates think that or indicate an increase in the level of emigration from about 21 million people, more or less, in 2000 to about 25 million by 2005. So this is an acceleration of about 1 million people a year leaving Latin America. And migrating to the extra-regional destinations like the United States, Canada, Europe, and elsewhere. And that accounts for about 13% of the total global stock of migrants, which is really quite significant, and about 4% of the region's total population, although the figures are much higher for some countries than others. So this is really quite significant. In some countries, some of the larger economies, the figures are even more significant, particularly where they're associated with political conflict and refugee flows, as from Colombia, where 8% of the population has now left. And of course, the primary destinations are the ones that I've just mentioned, the United States in particular, some European countries, Canada, and a couple of others, such as Japan. But there are important new patterns of immigration to Latin America from outside the region that I think are really interesting. And one of those relates to the flow of people from China, which is really quite a recent phenomenon. And this is particularly strong in the Caribbean and in some parts of Central America, particularly Costa Rica, and is associated with the practice that Chinese firms have, not only in the Latin American context, but also in the Middle East and some other regions of the world, of importing its own their own labour supply, as it were, essentially bringing Chinese workers through the company structures to work on large infrastructural projects in other regions. And those sorts of practices have been a bit more evident in the Caribbean and in Central America. The Cricket World Cup, for instance, in the Caribbean, was associated with particularly high inflows of Chinese workers as the Chinese companies investing in the infrastructural development around the World Cup essentially bought them for periods of time. So immigration to Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, Dominica were really quite notable for some time. The movement of workers in connection with mining projects in some of the Andean countries are also quite significant. By contrast, the labour supply that Chinese firms in Brazil tend to use is the local labour supply. So there is again some regional variation. By contrast with regions such as Asia, intra-regional migration in Latin America is relatively less significant than levels of emigration. In Asia, the big story is about the movement from between the countries of the region. In Latin America, it's much more about emigration. But nevertheless, there are very, very important intra-regional flows of migration. Of course, the primary destinations are the larger economies, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Venezuela. But the patterns are actually a lot more complex than that. Smaller as well as larger economies are characterized by inward migration, often from neighboring states. So migration from Peru to Ecuador, for instance, or Colombia to Ecuador, from Haiti to the Dominican Republic, or the Bahamas, from Nicaragua to Costa Rica, and so on. And so those flows are really quite important. But the second important phenomenon is transit migration, the movement of people through other Latin American, Caribbean countries on their way to a destination which is normally, of course, the United States. And that's really quite interesting. Mexico has been the focus of attention in terms of transit migration, obviously because the United States government is most concerned with what's going on at the US-Mexico border. And it was estimated by the International Organization for Migration in 2006 that about 12,000 new Guatemalan migrants were arriving in the United States every year through Mexico. And that another 60,000 or so were deported from Mexico each year before they could reach the United States. So that's received really quite a lot of attention. But even in the Caribbean as well, we see the phenomenon of island hopping as people, say from Haiti in particular, are trying to reach the United States and essentially end up staying illegally in other Caribbean countries, essentially stuck there without the means of getting to the United States, often for very simple reasons like running out of money or finding themselves in situations of bondage or unfreedom in their place of work. And so what's really interesting at the moment is that across Latin America, for the first time really in recent years, people are really beginning to talk quite concretely about immigration policies in Latin American countries. It's not simply that it's the United States that's interested in immigration now. Mexico has been pushed very, very hard by the United States, for instance, to have a serious immigration policy. And that's something that we're not really accustomed to talking about in Latin America and the Caribbean. Internal migration is, of course, important in some parts of the region, and Brazil being a notable example. Countries like Mexico, particularly associated with the establishment of export processing zones in the border regions. There's a lot of movement from southern Mexico to northern Mexico. Forced internal migration is also very significant, notably, of course, in Colombia. Massive process of internal displacement brought about by civil conflict, particularly in terms of rural to urban migration. But that also takes international forms in the migration of a large number of Colombians, as I indicated before, to Ecuador in particular, and also to Venezuela, as well as to the United States, Spain, and elsewhere. And obviously we don't have accurate figures for this, but estimates indicate that there are probably somewhere in the region of 3 million Colombians living in neighbouring countries, at least half of whom, probably around 2/3, were displaced by paramilitary violence in Colombia. And the case of Ecuador is particularly interesting. It only became a significant destination country for migration fairly recently, since about 2001, but it's now become the largest recipient of people in search of international protection and asylum in Latin America. That's the distinguishing characteristic now of Ecuador. And the International Organization for Migration estimates that there are about 200,000 Colombians moved from Colombia to Ecuador in the decade from 2001, and about 55,000 of those have been granted refugee status in Ecuador. And so that's really quite a significant development in terms of patterns of migration for Ecuador. 98% of those refugees, or those granted refugee status, of course, were Colombian. Moving on, just a couple more characteristics. Even though forced migration and refugee migration is important, particularly in that Colombian context and also in the Cuban context, nevertheless, migration in Latin America remains dominated by labour migration. Like in other regions of the world, the profile of labour migration is really quite heterogeneous. On the one hand, you have migration of low-skilled, low-paid workers, and on the other hand, the migration of highly educated, highly skilled workers. In terms of migration within the region and within countries in the region, the former, low-skilled, low-paid, poor workers, predominates overwhelmingly. You see very, very slight forms of migration of highly educated, highly paid professional people within the region. But obviously migration to other parts of the world from Latin America is more heterogeneous than that. Migration from Mexico and Central America to the United States, again, is overwhelmingly low-paid, low-skilled, poorer workers, whereas migration from South America and the Caribbean to the United States is significantly dominated by highly skilled, educated professional workers, and that distinction is really quite significant. And this I think is an interesting point. This sharply distinguishes the patterns of migration in Latin America and the Caribbean from patterns of migration in other parts of the world. That those high levels of migration of the highly skilled, highly paid professional people from countries like, or from countries of South America to the United States really does set Latin America and the Caribbean apart. It has to be said, of course, that, and I just want to make this point briefly, although it's an important one, that the fact that people end up in low-paid, low-skilled jobs in countries like the United States doesn't necessarily reflect their level of educational attainment. As across the world, there is a very strong process by which people end up in jobs that are by far inferior to the skills and education levels that they offer in the labour market. And so you find people with university degrees who are working as janitors and gardeners and so on. The distinction between forced migration and labour migration, though, shouldn't be overdone, and of course they come together very, very clearly in the concept of trafficking. And this is something, very interestingly, that's received quite a lot of attention in recent years, and increasing attention in Latin America and the Caribbean, not least because the United States government has come to be obsessed with it. It now has an annual process called the Trafficking in Persons report, in which, kind of similar to the way that it used to approach its anti-narcotics strategy in the 1980s, it gives other countries, not itself, other countries a score for the extent to which they are cooperating with the US government strategy of reducing trafficking around the world. So it's back to the 1980s of drug certification, and of course it's politicised in the very same way. Cuba is always right at the bottom of the list, and other countries that are politically more friendly with the United States are right at the top of the list. It's the same old thing. And it doesn't go down very well in Latin America and the Caribbean, but of course there are strong incentives to comply, even if it's just a bit of window dressing here and there. Even among left-wing governments in the Andean countries, there is at least minimal compliance with what the United States has tried to push. But these problems are very well documented between countries in Latin America, between countries in Latin America and the United States or Spain or elsewhere. Forced labour tends to receive rather less attention, but the exception, as I noted in a presentation last week, is Brazil, where the government has really tried to do something quite strenuous in this kind of area. And then the final issue that I just want to mention briefly is that, as elsewhere in the world, a feminisation of migration has been evident in the kinds of patterns that we've seen in Latin America and the Caribbean, as female migrants have become more important in overall flows of workers moving between countries and to destinations outside the region. It's now thought that female migrants account for about half of the total number of people on the move in and from the region. Obviously associated with domestic service, but export processing zones and those kinds of work. Obviously men are predominant in construction, agriculture, and so on. So let's go back then to the drivers of this migration maldevelopment nexus that I outlined just at the beginning. Some of these arguments will be quite familiar, but nevertheless they're worth bringing together to show the processes by which outcomes of migration can be developmentally regressive when we take a perspective on human development, the material and social conditions in which people live, rather than a focus on aggregate national economic growth. And the key here, as elsewhere in the world, is the process of flexibilization that has occurred over the last 20 or 30 years, associated with the movement towards neoliberal development strategies. The idea is, of course, that you have to dismantle the relationship between labour and capital so as to reduce production costs, to allow companies to reduce their production costs, essentially by reducing the cost of labour. So what we see is a very rapid movement towards an increase in casual, temporary, seasonal, part-time work, an increase in employers' ability to hire and fire workers at will, to employ people on informal and often illegal basis, and so on. That kind of story is quite well known, and it's very, very evident in Latin America and the Caribbean. We've seen a very arresting expansion of precarious work over the 1990s and the 2000s, and that's often hidden by the sort of headline news about employment trends and trends in poverty reduction. So over the 2000s, for instance, there was an increase in average household income across the region, speaking at an aggregate level, of course, and that was driven predominantly by an increase in wages. And so people were essentially earning more. In other cases, the key factor was an increase in net employment. So there were more jobs available, created by patterns of economic growth and so on. But the point is that the bulk of that employment growth has been in the low productivity, low wage sectors of the informal economy, and its nature has been insecure, precarious, unprotected. That's where the employment growth has occurred. And so what we have now are fewer problems of unemployment, or at least lower aggregate levels of unemployment, but massively increased levels of underemployment and massively increased levels of vulnerability to exploitation and abuse in the labour relationship. And that's particularly associated with those sectors that are integrated into global production networks, global value chains. And so what we essentially have is an inherently vulnerable, disposable labour force that can be hired and fired at will, that is working in substantially unprotected conditions, and hence, of course, are vulnerable to all of the vagaries of labour markets and the whims of particular employers. And the notion of adverse incorporation, I've spoken about this elsewhere, has this week has I think is useful in trying to understand this. That what matters is not whether somebody is employed, but the conditions under which they are employed, not whether somebody is able to work, but the conditions in which they are working. And these conditions can be adverse at least as often. And looking at the groups of people that we're talking about now, probably more often than they can be associated with better working conditions, better wages, and so on. And the connections with migration here are really very strong. The critical point is to recognise that the poorest of the poor in Latin America, as across the world, are the least mobile. The poor are not the people who are moving. And so while net employment among migrant workers is quite high, otherwise, of course, they wouldn't be moving if there weren't the opportunities for work, it's extremely precarious, and levels of abuse and exploitation are extremely high. And across the board, across all of the sectors that we can think of that are characterised by these forms of precarious employment, migrant workers are strongly and in many cases overwhelmingly represented. Whether we think about Brazilian agriculture or coffee worker, Haitian coffee workers in the Dominican Republic, or sugar workers, or whatever, the examples abound. We also, of course, have to think about what happens to migrant workers from Latin America in, say, the United States, in the garments industry in Los Angeles, the sweatshop conditions in which many people work. And we also have to think about the conditions under which immigrants to Latin America end up working. And here I go back to the issue of Chinese immigration into Latin America, which has been strongly associated with conditions of debt bondage, high levels of abuse and exploitation, essentially unprotected, exploitative conditions of work, and that's increasingly now documented, particularly in countries like Costa Rica. The second dimension of this, as I said, relates to recruitment, smuggling, trafficking. I put these in the same category not because they are the same thing, just to get that clear right from the start, but because together they encompass the universe of what's come to be called the migration industry. The illicit migration industry is of particular interest to us here. In terms of recruitment, what we know we've seen, particularly over the last 10, 15 years or so, is an explosion of private labour contractors as the agents that facilitate these patterns of movement. Some, of course, are legitimate, registered, performing a valuable service. Others aren't. And the point is that there are all sorts of opportunities within that relationship for the kinds of outcomes that we're concerned with. So these private labour contractors essentially represent an intermediary between the worker and a company in a different destination, and that can again be internal within the region or in destinations outside the region. And very often what happens, and here's where the maldevelopment questions come in. Very often what happens is that the contract, if a contract exists at all, that a worker has, is not with the employer, not with the person who uses her labour, but with the recruiter. And so employers are enabled to say, well, we know nothing about this. This worker isn't on our books. We don't have a contract with her. Whatever the conditions are in which she is found to be working are not our responsibility. And so again, there's that rupture in terms of responsibility for labour standards. And the point is that across the world, but in Latin America as well, private labour contractors are essentially unregulated. There have been a couple of instances in, say, China, where there's been an attempt to try to crack down, but it hasn't happened in Latin America just yet. And so the opportunities for abuse are rife. And of course, the lines quickly blur between the legal or the licit and the illegal or the illicit. And these recruitment networks are strongly associated also with smuggling networks and trafficking networks. In terms of smuggling, the industry is thriving. The industry is thriving. associated particularly that there seems to be an inverse relationship between the health of the smuggling industry and the restrictive qualities of US immigration policy. Essentially, as US immigration policy gets tighter, the smuggling industry thrives. That's essentially the relationship, which of course is missed in most of the discourse about immigration in the United States. If you build a wall, it won't stop people wanting to migrate. It will simply mean that smugglers and traffickers can charge much higher fees for trying to get people across, because it's much harder to do so, and you end up with all sorts of, the familiar situations of abuse, indebtedness, and so on. So there is absolutely no drop in illegal migration facilitated by smugglers as US immigration policies got more restrictive. Quite to the contrary, it simply meant more money for the smugglers, and it forces it further underground. So the abuses are quite well known. I don't think I need to. I don't need to go into the details there. It's simply to say that the health of the smuggling industry is testament to the demand for those kinds of services, which continues to grow. As people seek a way to better their lives in terms of the wages that they can earn, the security that they can achieve, the opportunities that they can offer to their children, and so on. Sometimes these things are achieved. The point is that there are real vulnerabilities that are built into the growth of the illegal migration industry that can't be ignored, and they're really significant in shaping this migration maldevelopment nexus that I've talked about. I want to say a little bit less about trafficking. Because it's well documented, but and associated in some respects with smuggling, although it's not the same thing. But just to say that there are very, very strong connections with migration. Very often, people end up in situations of trafficking, having thought that they were contracting the services of a legitimate recruiter or, in inverted commas, legitimate smuggler. Of course, it's illegal, but nevertheless somebody who was offering these services, and they had a friend who had used that person or whatever it was. So they thought that what they were embarking on was a project of migration. They ended up in a situation of trafficking characterised by forced labour at the other end. Time's ticking along, but I'm coming to my third category here. Poverty and inequality. I've already mentioned this. I don't think we need to go over the ground again. When I was talking about adverse incorporation and labour markets, I was suggesting the ways in which the explosion of precarious employment in Latin America and for migrants from Latin America in other countries is a really important way in which poverty and vulnerability to poverty are reinforced in this migration maldevelopment nexus. Aggregate poverty levels across Latin America have fallen, and in some cases quite dramatically, in terms of the significant reduction of extreme poverty. It does still exist, but nevertheless real progress has been made over the course of the 1990s and 2000s in eradicating extreme poverty. But the problem has shifted. The problem is not now extreme poverty in most cases, but poverty among the working poor. And this, again, is something that's very often not captured by discourses about poverty reduction. The key here is that most government social safety nets, most international global efforts at poverty reduction are focused on the extremely poor, on the indigent and the destitute. And so poverty among the working poor, and particularly vulnerability to transient poverty, is really not addressed. So essentially, again, that's another mechanism by which the precarious and vulnerable position of migrant workers is perpetuated. And these processes have occurred alongside a vast growth in inequality. The inequality is not associated with a vast growth of poverty. Poverty levels, as I said, have actually improved a fair amount in Latin America. It's associated, of course, with the vast increase in wealth in the richest sections of the population. So it's not that the floor is dropping; it's that the ceiling is going through the roof. To coin a phrase, this in the region, of course, that was already known to be the most unequal in the world. But the relationship between inequality and migration is not straightforward. The classic line, of course, is that migration is driven by inequalities, and particularly by inequalities in wages. That if people can earn 4 times as an agricultural worker in California what they would be working in, what they would be earning in southern Mexico, then clearly they're going to migrate, and that's a safe assumption to make. It was part of the discourse about the NAFTA in the mid-90s, that essentially the idea was that the NAFTA would enhance Mexican development to the extent that those wage differentials were reduced and people would be less likely to migrate. Well, of course, it didn't happen. NAFTA didn't produce those kinds of outcomes. But even so, that assumption was problematic. And the reason why it's problematic is that development itself is more often a spur to migration than a barrier than existing in an inverse relationship. It's not the poorest of the poor who are migrating. It's those who have some means to migrate. Development expands people's aspirations, people's horizons. Projects of migration are not just about the hourly wage in Californian agriculture, but about a much broader idea about opportunities and so on. So the idea that given the choice, people would stay where they are is clearly wrong. You only have to look at the history of the world to know that it is clearly wrong, and that people would prefer to stay where they are if there were opportunities. But I just want to highlight, and this is my penultimate point, that there is an actually more interesting relationship between inequality and migration in Latin America, and that relates not to the bottom end associated with labour migration, but to the top end associated with the migration of the highly paid, or the threat of migration, I should say, the highly paid, highly skilled, highly educated, professional people. And it's been referred to, I think quite interestingly, as a kind of inequality trap. High levels of socioeconomic inequality seem, and this is something that I'm trying to work on a bit at the moment, seem to be associated with a lower propensity to migrate among the very rich, the highly educated, those with university education. So, for instance, the incentives of the incentives for the richest 20% of Brazilians to emigrate are really quite low. They already command about a 64% share of national income. The lifestyle that they enjoy in Brazil is no different from that which they would achieve by migrating. That would be different, say, in India, where the share of national income enjoyed by the rich is very much lower than in somewhere like Brazil or in Mexico. And significantly, what this seems to achieve is a structural barrier to progressive taxation, to redistribution, to anything which harms the position of the very rich because of that threat of migration. Essentially, this is a strategy by which governments seek to hang on to those that have university education, that have skills, are highly paid, are professional, and so on. And so what happens, and Devesh Kapoor and others have done some really interesting work on this, is that low-income countries, including in Latin America, very often find themselves between a rock and a hard place. And governments, in trying to think about what to do in terms of progressive taxation, find themselves between a rock and a hard place, where they either have to tolerate much higher levels of inequality than they might like, or risk losing the brightest and the best. Essentially, people will simply go to New York City instead. And that threat of migration is very strong politically as well as structurally in perpetuating this migration maldevelopment nexus. I want to conclude in my last minute with just one other point. And that's that in talking about a migration maldevelopment nexus, I don't want to be mistaken for as indicating that things get worse for people when they migrate, even when they migrate into these kinds of conditions. Very often people can be going from extremely bad situations to marginally better. And we might be able to observe these situations and think that this is highly exploitative, highly precarious, highly insecure, highly dangerous, hazardous, and so on, detrimental to the aims of human development. But nevertheless, it can still represent a valid development strategy for the person concerned. And this, I think, is the problem. that we, in speaking about a migration maldevelopment nexus, clearly we're trying to put in place, or working on the basis of assumptions about what is developmentally acceptable, what is ethically acceptable in terms of the conditions in which people live and work. Where then do people's own calculations about the conditions in which they live and work come into play? I'll end just on that question. Very often what you see with the migration of the highly educated, the highly skilled professional is more of a permanent pattern, that people are less likely to return. There are all sorts of programs that have been put in place over quite a long period of time, and still are being put in place to try to encourage, for instance, people who go to study overseas to come back, and across the world, not just in Latin America, but also to try to encourage professionals like nurses, doctors, and so on to return, particularly in the Caribbean. There are a couple of programs emerging now where the government's trying to attract people back, as they are in Southern Africa, for instance. So the patterns tend to be a little bit more permanent, but not exclusively, of course. Very often people can go and study overseas and then return. In terms of labour migration, it's a lot more complicated. There are very, very high levels of circular migration, temporary migration, particularly within the region where the barriers to movement are not as pronounced. So when you're pretty freely able to cross borders, when there aren't too many restrictions, or of course within, say, the Mercosur region where there are provisions allowing for mobility of people, you see much more temporary circular kind of churn in terms of the labour force. It's different then when you're talking about migration to the United States. And again, this is one of the really nonsensical aspects of US immigration policy, that it wants to encourage people not to stay. The big problem are people who arrive and simply don't go anywhere. But the problem is that circular migration is virtually impossible, particularly if you don't have the right kind of visa, if you don't have the right essentially to leave the country and come back in. And so for the vast majority of migrants, particularly those who are undocumented, obviously once they're in, they have to stay. And there's simply no choice. The risks of leaving and trying to get back in again are simply too great, particularly when you've spent several years worth of wages and gone to great personal risk to arrive there. So it's a mixture, and it depends on who is migrating, where they're migrating to, what kinds of immigration policies exist, and so on. Although it has to be said, that as I just indicated, that crossing some borders in Latin America is really very easy. That there's very little difference between going to work 30 kilometres down the road in another town and going to work 30 kilometres in the other direction, which actually happens to cross the border in the meantime. And very often recruiters come in over the border in the morning, pick people up who are standing on the side of a road and go back in the other direction. And so the idea of the border, in parts of the region at least, is much more porous. And the distinctions are not quite as pronounced. But of course, where there are significant costs associated with movement, either because of distance or because you need to employ these services of people to recruit you or to smuggle you or whatever it is, then obviously the patterns are that the poorest of the poor are the least mobile. Yeah. I cut out loads of this presentation, for the purposes of cramming it into, I think it's about 47 minutes in the end, but 45 minutes. And yes, the patterns are, I just decided to leave the question of the crisis to one side. The patterns that I identified do still persist today. They haven't been so fundamentally altered by the crisis that they've become sort of outdated in any sense. But the crisis has contributed quite interesting new developments, and I just decided it was a step too far to get into it. One of them is, of course, migrants returning. And so, for instance, I was in Bogota in 2009, and there was a big panic at the time about what on earth to do with all these people who were going to be coming back from Spain and the United States because there were no jobs anymore in the construction industry. As it turned out, those massive inflows didn't materialise. People actually sort of went elsewhere and just sort of moved around to other destination countries. But I remember there was a big panic about what on earth was going to happen when all these hundreds of thousands of people were coming home. Well, anyway. The other interesting thing, precisely as you say, has been going on for quite a long time over the course of the 2000s, but has accelerated with the slowdown in some of the major traditional destination countries, and that's associated with the better economic performance of, say, the Brazilian economy than some European economies or the United States economy in particular sectors. I alluded, but didn't go into much detail about patterns of Chinese investment and the way that has spurred particular kinds of migration patterns, both internal and from other countries across the region, particularly in South America. Mining projects, infrastructural projects, energy projects of various descriptions. The biofuels revolution and so on has been quite significant as well. So there are additional elements to the picture which I didn't include, but nevertheless they don't change the broad structural characteristics that I mentioned before. I don't know. I mean, tell me if I've misinterpreted your question, but I wonder if we might be using the term underemployment in different ways. I'm using the term underemployment as a shortage of employment opportunities. So somebody doesn't know from one day to the next whether they're going to be able to work. So they might be able to work for 4 days a week, but that isn't enough to generate the kind of income that's necessary for basic subsistence. Or they might be able to work for 2 days a week, 1 week. They might have a month of full-time work, but then nothing for 6 months. It's that kind of underemployment. So it's not enough to earn a living wage, although these people are not classed as unemployed because they do have access to work. I think what you might have been talking about was a bit of a different phenomenon, which I also alluded to, which was the ways in which migrant workers in particular can find themselves performing jobs or working in jobs that are inferior to the level of skill and education that they have. So people with university degrees working in as janitors or gardeners or whatever, or in cafes, according to your example. And I think you could have those debates conceivably in countries like the United States and others, where constantly you hear the refrain that all these dirty, dangerous jobs, are ones that you simply can't get American workers to do anymore. And I'm not persuaded by that particular kind of argument. Obviously, if they were under better conditions, then there would be more Americans that were willing to do them. So I don't think that's the kind of I don't think that's an accurate reflection of the relationship between the creation of jobs at the top end and the creation of jobs at the lower end. Oh yeah. I started off the presentation talking about precisely that, and the really interesting thing has been that, as in Asia, the flows of remittances to Latin America and the Caribbean at a sort of aggregate level didn't collapse with the economic crisis in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. They've actually proved to be quite resilient. Growth might have slowed, but that's very different from a drop in overall levels of remittances. And so, particularly for countries that traditionally have received very high levels of remittances, some of the Andean countries, Central America, Caribbean, Mexico even, although the relationship is a bit different there, they've remained and possibly even grown in importance as a source of foreign exchange, and more importantly, financing for families, communities, and so on. But there was a panic, again, in about 2008, 2009, not only that all these people were going to be coming home, but that they wouldn't be sending any money, which goes to demonstrate the extent to which governments, communities have come to depend on remittances, have basically been told that remittances are gold dust, and that you can build a development strategy on the basis of remittances, on the basis of what workers are doing in another country and sending back to their families. Of course, these workers are the people who are sending remittances tend to be poorer workers. The amount remitted by each worker per week or per month is minuscule. It's simply, as a proportion of their wages, quite high, but minuscule in terms of in terms of the absolute amount. But the idea has been that there are so many people doing this that you can build a national development strategy on that basis. And the crisis has sort of shaken that confidence a little bit, but not very much. This is precisely the problem, that everything that we might say about the exploitative, precarious, the kinds of work that people end up in, the hardships that they endure, the forms of social marginalisation in which they exist, the abuses that are associated with movement, with recruitment, and so on, doesn't hide the fact that very often the goals for which people migrated are achieved. This is precisely the point that that I made at the end of the presentation that you're picking up on. I don't think that should prevent us from saying that these conditions, particularly in terms of labour conditions, are not acceptable. That we need to do much more to improve those, to try to close some of those spaces in which real forms of exploitation and abuse emerge, and the horrendous conditions in which people live. But at the same time recognising that this can be a strategy, as I said, for human development on the part of the migrant person themselves, or a particular family unit which decides to base its livelihood on the migration of one or more family members. And I think that's precisely the problem, that what you very often have is a disjuncture between the forms of opportunity that are granted by somebody's sacrifice and hardship to their family, obviously most often their children, associated with education, and the kinds of conditions in which they themselves are living, which can be horrendous. And so this is why I think that the relationship is complex. There is no simple unilinear relationship between migration and development, or migration and maldevelopment. It depends on what you mean by development. It depends on whose perspective you're looking at it from. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't, nothing, unfortunately, that I can say sort of resolves the problem and resolves the contradiction. And I think it comes down also to a question of can I put it this way, a question of rights. Very often what you find, particularly in discussions about brain drain, are about the rights of the individual to migrate to wherever they want to and live their lives wherever they want to, and the responsibilities that they should or should not be thought to have to their country or to their communities. And I think your point also picks up on that, that in thinking about the horrendous conditions which often attach to migration, particularly of the sort that I'm looking at here, should we therefore be thinking about how to deny people the right to migrate and to enter these, really quite dreadful jobs, but nevertheless jobs that enable them to earn higher wages and to educate their children more easily than they might otherwise have been able to do. And that's an ethical argument as much as much as an empirical one.
Research, I would say.
It goes in the other direction as well, that in some contexts it has been women who have migrated, and they have become the principal earners. That's particularly strong, for instance, in migration to the border regions of Mexico to work in export processing zones, or in parts of the Caribbean, in garments factories or whatever. So it can work in the other direction. I'm slightly uneasy with a lot of the literature and the debate that's emerging on that, because the idea is that somebody will go and study or work in the United States and come back enlightened, come back with nice liberal values about fairness and transparency in public office, and everything will be fine. It's almost as if those people are the sort of, and I say this as a representation of the kind of literature and some of the policy discourse about it. It's almost as if they're the kind of civilizing agents, that they come back with different sets of values and everything's transformed. So I'm uneasy with a lot of that. But I think there clearly are processes of change that are underway. I don't know enough about them to be able to comment, and I haven't conducted my own work on them. It's quite interesting, though, of course, to think about it the other way around, and this is something that's never very far from the news about the impact of large migrant populations on politics in the host countries, particularly, obviously, in the United States, the Hispanic vote. I was reading just this morning about how Romney is trying to negotiate that. Also, how say Mexican presidential campaigns are conducted in the United States as well as in Mexico. The candidates have to go touring some of the hubs, if you like, of where Mexican migrants are concentrated on their campaign trails in the United States. So I think that's important. But I don't have an answer to your question, but it is an interesting thing. Particularly in terms of people going to study overseas, are likely to dramatically increase their level of education, but also their viability in the sort of high-end labour market, and the relationship is a very positive one as people return. There are also then those who migrate, as I said, often people with high school or university education who end up working as janitors and gardeners. Earning higher wages in some cases than they might have been able to earn in their own countries, or simply because there are very few opportunities for work in their place of origin, and so they some work is better than no work, and that's a completely different kind of relationship. Then obviously that is regressive for those individuals rather than helping them to enhance their prospects, as it were. But I think it ties in a little bit with John's question. There's a dreadful word that's sort of come to be bandied around in these sorts of discussions, and that's about social remittances, about how the relationship between migration and development can be positive, not only because people might come back with different ideas, which I think is a slightly dubious argument in a lot of cases, but because people come back with high levels of skill, greater experience, can work in all of these emerging transnational companies of Brazilian origin or Mexican origin or whatever it is, and contribute to that process of economic development. And of course, there are contexts in which that relationship does seem to work. There are also contexts in which it doesn't appear to, and that I think is about a lot of what I've been talking about in terms of the conditions in which people find themselves when they have migrated.
The pattern is not dominant, and there is not one single pattern.
No, there isn't one single pattern. You can find very, very strong evidence of a variety of different outcomes in that sort of in that respect. What has happened is that in 2008, 2009, people were simply expecting employment opportunities to dry up in, say, Spain or the United States, particularly in sectors like construction, and then people would come home. And what's happened is that people have simply moved on, either to work in other kinds of sectors that have not been so hard hit by recession, or to other countries where opportunities might be more plentiful. So people are not actually finding themselves unemployed without any prospects and returning home. They're simply going to look for the prospects elsewhere, which of course is testament to the sort of versatility, I suppose, with which people approach these questions of work. So that's part of the that's part of the picture. In certain instances, of course, there are particular initiatives or policies which have enabled people to stay, amnesties in Spain, for instance, and so people have not had to, people have been given the kind of documentation that they need to work in better protected, less precarious jobs as a result of the regularisation of their status, and so on. Often what you might find is that people who had a visa, say, to work in the construction industry, that was the sort of visa that tied you to one employer, have simply left that employer and gone underground, and are now working in the informal economy, still earning wages, still remitting money, but nevertheless not working for the employer that their visa stipulated. Those sorts of patterns. So it's quite complex, but the overall outcome seems to have been that remittances have held up, roughly. The growth has slowed, as I said, but absolute volumes haven't dropped particularly in most cases. In some cases they have a little bit. And that people have simply moved on to other destinations or other kinds of work rather than finding themselves simply on the streets and out of work. Although, of course, it has to be said that there are lots of people who have found themselves in those kinds of difficulties and simply haven't had the means to return home or to move on anywhere else. And there has been an increase in destitution among migrant workers in some parts of the world.
There'll be an opportunity for some informal discussion outside.
With a glass of wine.
But first, let me once again thank Nicola for not just this talk, which was, of course, really interesting and informative, but for a number of talks now. Four, I think, at the ANU. So we certainly got we've got value for money, not just in terms of the quality of the talks, but also actually in terms of the quantity since she's been here. So please join me once again.